Having seized the initiative on the seas of the Pacific theater of World War II, the United States pressed its advantage by launching ground campaigns to capture the Solomon Islands. By August of 1942, the Americans made their first moves to dislodge the Japanese from the South Pacific in the Battle of Guadalcanal. After establishing an initial foothold within marine landings, the United States quickly found itself on the defensive. It would be the first time they faced off against a major Japanese Army unit. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson would lead the defense of Hill 123 at Lunga Ridge on Guadalcanal from September 12th to the 14th. Facing 3 Japanese soldiers for every American, Edson's unit fought valiantly to defend the key strategic location overlooking Henderson Airfield. At nightfall, under absolute darkness, they stood their ground against incessant waves of Japanese soldiers sent by General Kawaguchi. Against all odds, the American troops defending the ridge shifted the landscape of the entire war, marking the beginning of Japan's defeat in the South Pacific. Allied troops, mostly from the United States, arrived on Guadalcanal, Tulagi, and the Nila Islands on August 7, 1942. These landings intended to keep the Japanese from using the islands as bases that could threaten supply routes between Oceania and the United States. Securing the islands would also provide launching points for the campaign against the Japanese base at Rabaul and the Allied campaign in New Guinea. The arrival of the American troops marked the start of the Guadalcanal campaign, which would go on for 6 months. By the night of August 8th, the Allies had taken over Tulagi and the airfield under construction at Luga Point, on the north end of Guadalcanal. This took the Japanese completely by surprise. General Alexander Archer Vandergrift sent his 11,000 men under the 1st Marine Division to the Luga Point airfield to set up a loose perimeter. Led by the respected Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson, also known as Red Mike, they cemented their position. Edson was already becoming a wartime legend, earning 2 Navy Crosses. It had been partially his foresight that led them to establish the perimeter. He believed that the Japanese were planning to attack Lunga Ridge, while Vandergrift believed they would attack from another point. Edson and Colonel Gerard Thomas convinced their superior that they needed to defend the area. The airfield was named Henderson Field in honor of a Marine aviator lost in the Battle of Midway, Lofton Henderson, on August 12th. Allied planes and pilots operating from the field were then labeled Cactus Air Force due to the Allied code name for Guadalcanal. As a response to the new American position and threat, the Imperial Japanese Army assigned the 17th Army based at Rabdul to retake Guadalcanal. The military team was under the command of Lieutenant General Jarukichi Hyakutake. The Japanese underestimated the strength of the Allies in Guadalcanal. A nighttime assault from the front on Alligator Creek, the eastern side of the Marine Lunga perimeter, on August 21st was devastating for Japan. Only 128 of the 917 Japanese First Element troops returned from the engagement, known as the Battle of the Tanaru. The surviving troops traveled back to Taivu Point to notify headquarters of the result of the battle and await further instructions and hopefully reinforcements. By August 23rd, General Kiyotaki Kawaguchi and his unit had arrived at Truk for transport to Guadalcanal. Due to the Allied destruction of a troop convoy in a previous battle, the Japanese decided to transport the soldiers to Rabadul. From there, they were taken aboard destroyers to the Imperial Navy's base in the Shortland Islands. The ships could make the trip from there to Guadalcanal and back in one night, reducing the probability of an Allied air attack. Still, the heavy military equipment and supplies could not be transported along with the soldiers, and had to be part of separate high-speed destroyer runs that the Japanese called rat transportation. The Allies nicknamed it the Tokyo Express. Japanese Admiral Tanaka, who masterminded the Tokyo Express, saw successful undetected and undeterred landings of reinforcements and supplies through the system. As the campaign became a war of attrition focused on landing troops and preventing the enemy from landing theirs, the United States became rightfully concerned that the successful arrival of General Kawaguchi and the 35th Infantry through the Tokyo Express could cause significant trouble. Following a string of skirmishes leading up to the battle on the ridge, the Japanese withdrew into the jungle to gather themselves. On September 11th, bombs started raining down on the American position by means of Betty bombers. Colonel Edson knew that a follow-up attack was imminent and inevitable, and at midnight on September 12, 1942, the Battle of Bloody Ridge commenced. For the Marines, this conflict would be known as the Battle of Edson's Ridge. Between August 21st and September 3rd, General Alexander Archer Vandergrift had made intense efforts to improve the defensive capabilities of the Lunga perimeter. He had relocated 3 Marine battalions from Tulagu and Gavutu to Guadalcanal, including Lieutenant Colonel Merritt A. Edson's 1st Raider Battalion. In total, they added 1,500 soldiers to the initial 11,000 men protecting Henderson Field. The 1st Parachute Battalion, heavily reduced in August due to losses at the Battle of Tulagi and Gavutu-Tanambogo, was now under Edson's command as well. Still, they were outnumbered and theoretically outmatched by the Japanese forces. Come midnight of September 12th, the Japanese troops followed an artillery barrage, emerging from the jungle to take down the Marines. Fortunately for the Americans, the Japanese attack was a bit disorganized, in that the first wave engaged before the rest of the units were ready. This helped Edson keep the perimeter and launch preparations for likely incoming attacks. Unknown to the Marines, they were outnumbered by the Japanese by more than 3 to 1. In the evening on September 12th, as nightfall chased the American soldiers, Edson stepped atop a grenade box and addressed his troops, saying, quote, "You men have done a great job so far, but I have one more thing to ask of you. We have to hold out just one more night. I know we have been without sleep a long time, but I expect another attack, and I believe they will come through here. If we hold, I have every reason to believe we will be relieved in the morning." The Japanese emerged from the jungle at nightfall. General Kawaguchi sent his 3,000 soldiers to vanquish Edson's 830 during a pitch-black, moonless night. An attack on the right flank kicked the Marine Raiders of Company B out of their hilltop position. At the same time, a different wave pushed back the Marines to the 1st Parachute Battalion. In response to these two events, Edson ordered his troops to fall back to the command post at the center of the ridge on Hill 123. The next Japanese attack hit another company, which also pushed them back. The situation was increasingly showing in favor of Japan. The American soldiers were getting scared and falling back, till Edson came out of the command post with a couple of officers and strongly yelled at his soldiers to keep on fighting. The rest of the Raider companies were doing their best to hold their positions. The Marines made a horseshoe line around Hill 123 to defend it. The Japanese battalion rained down in frontal waves of assaults. They charged with only minimal fighting from parachute flares dropped by a Japanese float plane. The Marines fought back valiantly as the Japanese propped up a 75mm regimental gun to Hill 80. This gun was intended to completely turn the battle in favor of the Japanese and help obliterate the American command post. The Americans were blessed by the failure of the gun's firing pin. Wave after wave of Japanese soldiers rained on the Marines. More than 2,500 Japanese soldiers fought the 830 men under Edson's command. Things did not look good. While the Lunga perimeter's left flank had become exposed, Edson decided to flank it with fixed bayonets that surprised the Japanese and drove many of them off the hill. The tide began turning as heavy artillery fire was used by the Marines against their enemy. The Japanese who made it past these defenses were met by armed soldiers. If some brave or talented soldier managed to avoid the guns, they would be met by American fists. Several hand-to-hand battles were fought in the darkness. Each wave of Japanese soldiers was taken down. Marine Captain William J. McKinnon would later recall, quote, "The Japanese attack was almost constant, like a rain that subsides for a moment and then pours the harder. When one wave was mowed down, and I mean mowed down, another followed it." The two final Japanese assaults happened before the break of dawn. Their remaining positions were subdued by U.S. Army Air Corps Airacobra fighter aircraft in the morning, and the Japanese began to pull back. The Battle of Bloody Ridge marked a great victory for the Marines, who called the conflict the Battle of Edson's Ridge. "5 minutes past 1 in the morning on September 14th, General Kawaguchi retreated with his remaining soldiers away from the ridge and into the safety of the jungle. There they took care of the wounded and rested for a day. He was ordered to further withdraw westward towards the Matanikau River Valley. The soldiers who could walk had to assist in transporting the wounded. They traveled hungry and tired, having eaten the last of their food supplies the morning before withdrawing. Many left their rifles and equipment behind to survive the trek. By the time they arrived at Kokumbona to meet up with another unit, only half of them were armed. General Kawaguchi had lost 830 men during the battle. A still unclear number of wounded soldiers were also lost during the trip to Matanikau. The Marines calculated taking out around 500 Japanese soldiers, while losing 80 comrades between the 12th and 14th of September. 2 companies from the 1st Battalion were sent by Vandegrift to follow the retreating Japanese on September 17th. They were ambushed by rear guards, and while 1 Marine platoon was lost, the rest returned to the Lunga perimeter. Vandegrift denied a request to rescue the missing platoon. Only a few wounded members of the platoon were heard from again. On September 20th, a patrol from Edson's battalion fought a retreating column of Japanese soldiers successfully. While the Japanese regrouped and planned, the Americans focused on improving the defenses at Lunga. Vandegrift brought in another battalion from Tulagi, and an Allied naval convoy brought in over 4,000 troops from a provisional Marine brigade. With the reinforcements, the U.S. was able to create an unbroken line of defense around the perimeter. The Imperial Japanese Army had not suffered such a significant defeat before the Battle of Edson's Ridge and the war. After being informed of the failure, Japanese High Command realized that Guadalcanal could be a decisive factor in the broader conflict. The battle sent waves of repercussions to the Japanese strategy throughout the Pacific. General Hyakutake knew that to defeat the Allied forces, he would have to withdraw troops and material from New Guinea to sufficiently cover the Solomon Islands campaign. He ordered the New Guinea troops to withdraw, which at the time were only 30 miles away from Port Moresby, their target. The Japanese never recovered from this decision. They were unable to restart their assault in Port Moresby. Their defeat in the Battle of Edson's Ridge marked the start of their ultimate demise in the South Pacific. General John J. Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, called the Battle of Belleau Wood, quote, the biggest battle since Appomattox and the most considerable engagement American troops have ever had with a foreign enemy. In June of 1918, as Russia had withdrawn from World War I, Germany relocated thousands of soldiers to France and launched a massive offensive to end the war. But as the German army breached the Western Front and attempted to advance to Paris, it faced fierce resistance from Allied forces. A robust contingent of thousands of American soldiers and Marines arrived to fight the weakened Germans in the Belleau Wood Preserve area, and the first large-scale battle fought by U.S. forces during World War I ensued. Fighting mainly in the dark, with fixed bayonets, poison gas, and hand-to-hand combat amidst harsh wood terrains and overgrown wheat fields, the Marines engaged in savage combat that cemented their place in history as some of the fiercest of warriors. In March of 1918, the Germans launched the Ludendorff Offensive, a campaign to attack the Western Front before the United States deployed all their forces during World War I. A peace treaty with the Russians on the Eastern Front had freed up around 50 German divisions. They were now stationed in France and outnumbered the local army. The Germans achieved significant victories during the first weeks, and after the Third Battle of the Aisne in late May, they reached the north bank of the Marne River at Château-Thierry. The enemies were now 59 miles from Paris, and it became a priority to halt their progress. On May 31st, the U.S. forces supported the Senegalese tirailleurs to hold the German advance into Château-Thierry, forcing them to veer towards Vaux and Belleau Wood. After several fierce confrontations the next day, Chateau Thierry and Vaux ultimately fell, and the Germans moved into Belleau Wood, a square-mile game preserve beside a large wheat field. The area suddenly became an immensely strategic point, and U.S. forces were deployed en masse to support British and French troops. The American 2nd Infantry Division was summoned along the Paris-Metz highway. The 9th Infantry Regiment covered the area between the highway and the Marne, while the 6th Marine Regiment covered their left. The 5th Marine and the 23rd Infantry Regiments were put on reserve. Army General James Harbord commanded the Marine Brigade. The Allied forces would then work together to drive the Germans out of Belleau Wood. On the evening of June 1st, the German forces pierced through the French lines to the left of the Marines' position. The American 23rd Infantry and the 5th Marine Regiments immediately marched over 10 kilometers to plug the gap in the line. By nightfall the next day, they held a 12-mile front line along the rough terrain with thick bushes. This swift action might have prevented the Germans from marching into Paris. Meanwhile, the Germans set a major offensive through Belleau Wood, hoping to allow other German troops to cross the Marne River. The French had ordered to dig trenches further to the rear, but General Harbord had his men hold their ground instead. The Marines dug shallow fighting positions with their bayonets to target enemies from a prone position. On the afternoon of June 3rd, the Germans approached the Marines' location, but the Americans waited until the enemy was 100 yards from them to open fire. The attack proved successful, and the surviving Germans retreated into the forest. However, the demoralized French soldiers kept urging the Americans to retreat, but Captain Lloyd Williams famously exclaimed, quote, "Retreat? Hell, we just got here." Soon, the Marines stood alone, defending the area. At one point, while Captain George Wallace Hamilton and the 49th Company were getting into position, they were surrounded by German machine guns. But Hamilton caught the enemies off guard, capturing the guns and securing them for friendly forces. He was later awarded 2 Distinguished Service Crosses and a Navy Cross for his actions. By June 4th, Major General Omar Bundy of the 2nd Division took command of the U.S. forces. That same day, Intelligence Officer Lieutenant William A. Eddy and 2 men infiltrated German lines and gathered key information. Having undergone heavy casualties, the Germans had dug out a defensive line through Belleau Wood. They were also consolidating their machine gun positions and gathering artillery. Though an attack was not imminent, the increasing strength of the German forces raised concerns about a possible advance to Paris. Over the next 2 days, the Americans managed to repel several enemy attacks. The French 167th Division eventually arrived, and the Allies were able to secure 2,000 yards of front. On June 6th at 3:45 a.m., the Allies set off an assault against the Germans before they could even launch an attack of their own. The French 167th Division attacked through the left of the Marines' line, while the 1st Battalion, 6th Marine Regiment, went for Hill 142 to prevent flanking fire towards the French. The Marines relied on their combat superiority due to their rifle marksmanship. Moreover, the open warfare doctrine of General John J. Pershing mandated fast-moving and aggressive attacks to overwhelm the Germans and push them behind enemy lines. During a German counterattack on Hill 142, Gunnery Sergeant Ernest A. Jansen withstood 12 enemy soldiers by bayoneting 2 of them and forcing the rest to flee. He became the first U.S. Marine to receive the Medal of Honor during World War I. And machine gunner Henry Hulbert was also recognized with the Distinguished Service Cross for advancing through enemy fire during the same battle. As the second phase of the attack took off, the Allies failed to scout the woods thoroughly and missed a network of German machine gun nests and artillery. While advancing in waves from the west into the forest through the open wheat field, the 3rd Division, 5th and 6th Marine Battalions stumbled upon German machine gun fire. The 5th Regiment was shredded, while the 6th fought their way into the forest's southern edge. They encountered even more machine gun nests, sharpshooters, and barbed wire, and engaged in hand-to-hand combat. As the Americans were crawling and trying to survive against an implacable German force, 2-time Medal of Honor honoree 1st Sergeant Dan Daly flaunted his bayonet over his head and shouted the famous words, quote, "Come on, you sons of bitches. Do you want to live forever?" The Marines with him stood up and charged back. In the meantime, 2 companies from the 2nd Battalion, 6th Marine Regiment, crossed 800 yards towards the nearby village of Beaureche. Without artillery support, the companies withered at German gunfire coming from the woods. The remaining Marines made their way into the village and bravely expelled the Germans. Despite having captured Hill 142 and gaining a foothold in Belleau Wood, the Marines endured crippling losses that day. More than 1,000 men were injured and 222 lost their lives. It was the largest number of casualties suffered by a single American brigade in World War I up to that point. Commanding officer Major Thomas Holcomb described the feat in a letter to his wife, quote, The regiment has carried itself with undying glory, but the price was heavy. My battalion did wonderfully. There never was such self-sacrifice, courage, and spirit shown. With soldiers from the 2nd Regiment of Engineers and the 6th Machine Gun Battalion, the remaining Marines continued to face German forces as they attempted to take Belleau Wood. The ensuing confrontations proved increasingly brutal. The trees were heavily splintered with shelling, and loads of deadly wooden splinters and metal shrapnel laid on the ground. The Germans resorted to mustard gas to halt the American advances. Numerous hand-to-hand clashes broke out, using knives, rifle butts, bayonets, and even trench shovels. As Marine and non-commissioned officers fell, junior officers and soldiers took their places. Still, by June 11th, the American forces had secured most of Belleau Wood. The Germans fiercely counterattacked 2 days later, attempting to claim their former positions. But the French army unleashed a decisive bombardment that lasted 14 hours, allowing the Marines to dislodge the enemies. The battle would continue for 2 more weeks. The Marines executed a total of 6 planned attacks to expel the Germans. Finally, on June 26th, a final confrontation in the forests cleared Belleau Wood of all enemy forces. Major Shearer submitted a report later that day that read, quote, "Wood's now U.S. Marine Corps entirely." The French government renamed the forest Bois de la Brigade de la Marine in honor of the honorable sacrifice from the Marines during that fateful month. And members of the 4th Marine Brigade were awarded the French Croix de Guerre. The battle was an essential step towards the defeat of Germany, but it also proved incredibly brutal. Out of 9,500 American soldiers, about 1,000 were killed in action, and 4,000 were either wounded, gassed, or missing. The 2nd Battalion alone endured 764 casualties out of 900 men. Historian George B. Clark later wrote, quote, "For all intents and purposes, the old warriors of the U.S. Marine Corps were virtually wiped out." Despite its grim outcome, the Battle of Belleau Wood recognized the bravery of the Marines and changed the Marine Corps' lore forever, earning their elite fighter reputation and receiving the Devil Dogs moniker by their German counterparts. A German private later testified, quote, "We have Americans opposite us who are terribly reckless fellows." The night of January 29th, 1991, seemed like just another mission for the Air Force E-8 Joint Stars crew. This advanced surveillance aircraft, recently introduced to the American arsenal, had been tasked with scouring western Iraq for Scud missile sites and keeping a watchful eye on the territory ahead of the U.S. Army 7th Corps. 12 days into Operation Desert Storm, the crew had grown accustomed to the routine of monitoring the vast expanse of the Kuwaiti-Saudi border area. As the hours ticked by, the Joint Stars crew directed their state-of-the-art sensors toward southern Kuwait. Unusual activity had been detected in the previous days, stirring in the depths behind enemy lines. But tonight, the moving target indicators painted an alarming picture. The crew watched in disbelief as elements of Iraq's 5th Mechanized Division and 3rd Armored Division surged southward, poised to breach the border near the abandoned Saudi town of Khafji. The realization hit the crew like a thunderbolt. Iraq was about to unleash its own ground offensive and invade Saudi Arabia. In August 1990, Iraqi troops invaded Kuwait, marking the latest move in President Saddam Hussein's over a decade-long expansionist policy. The smaller and less militarized nation quickly succumbed to the army, and the leader declared it an Iraqi province, seizing its oil fields and fortifying its border with Saudi Arabia. However, the leader had drastically underestimated the international community's response. Nations worldwide condemned the invasion and imposed sanctions on Iraq. The crisis prompted the United States, led by President George H.W. Bush, to mount the largest military confrontation since the Cold War, assembling a powerful and diverse global coalition, including nations like Great Britain, France, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Syria, ready to defend Saudi Arabia and expel Iraqi forces from Kuwait. Despite the imminent threat of a coalition military intervention, Hussein refused to withdraw from Kuwait. At the time, he was convinced that the United States would be unable to maintain the coalition's unity or mount an effective military response. If an attack did happen, the leader was equally convinced that his massive military could inflict sufficient losses on the Americans to force them to abandon the struggle, as it had happened with Vietnam. The U.S. and its allies assembled a military force in Saudi Arabia called Operation Desert Shield to deter further Iraqi aggression. When diplomacy failed, Operation Desert Storm began on January 16, 1991, with massive aerial and missile bombardments to weaken Iraq's military for Kuwait's liberation. In an attempt to seize the initiative and alter the terms of the conflict, Saddam launched powerful Scud missile attacks against cities in Israel and Saudi Arabia, hoping to fracture the coalition. Instead, these attacks led to the Great Scud Hunt, with the coalition deploying some of the latest American aircraft, prototype E-8C J-Stars, to locate Scud launchers. In turn, Hussein also set fire to Kuwaiti oil fields and opened offshore terminals to create an environmental disaster. However, precision strikes by F-111F fighter bombers quickly shut down the oil pumps. With no end to the air campaign in sight, Hussein resorted to one final option: a mechanized offensive across the Saudi border, culminating in a major attack on the Saudi town of Khafji. On January 25th, Saddam Hussein summoned his senior military leaders to plan the attack. Although an outright victory against the coalition seemed unlikely, the leader believed that drawing America into a costly battle could weaken the resolve and potentially prevent the expulsion of Iraqi forces from Kuwait. The plan to achieve Saddam's strategic goals was straightforward. 5 Iraqi infantry divisions, known as the Saddam Line, guarded the Saudi-Kuwaiti border with minefields, anti-tank obstacles, and fortified positions. Meanwhile, the attack force, comprising the 3rd Armored, 5th Mechanized, and 1st Mechanized divisions, boasted an array of T-54, 55, and T-62 tanks, BMP-1 personnel carriers, and heavy artillery. Under Saddam's orders, they would launch a multi-pronged invasion of Khafji, engaging Saudi Arabian, Kuwaiti, and U.S. forces along the coastline. Another supporting Iraqi commando force would infiltrate further south by sea to harass the coalition's rear. Saddam's ultimate priority was to capture as many American personnel as possible, believing they would serve as valuable bargaining chips. This belief stemmed from perceived U.S. vulnerability showcased during the Vietnam War and the Iranian hostage crisis. An Iraqi prisoner from the battle later revealed to American interrogators, quote, "The sole purpose of the raid on Al-Qaeda was to capture coalition personnel. The loss of all Iraqi equipment and personnel involved in the raid was of no importance as long as POWs were captured." Preparations for the offensive began on January 26th, with earth-moving equipment digging berms and reinforcing artillery positions. In the following days, armored vehicles from the 3rd Armored Division moved into their designated positions. As January 29th, the planned invasion date, inched closer, the confrontation with the United States Hussein had waited years for was finally about to arrive. In comments to Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat, he declared, quote, "We are ready for it. We will fight America, and with God's will, we will defeat it and kick it out of the whole region." On the night of January 29, 1991, Air Force E-8 Joint Stars were on a patrol mission searching for Scud sites in western Iraq, and their sensors showed clear signs of an upcoming attack in the making. By then, it was clear the Iraqi army was starting the first major ground engagement of the Gulf War. At precisely 8 p.m., the silence of the desert night was shattered by the roar of Iraqi engines as column after column of armored vehicles and mechanized infantry surged forward, crossing the border into Saudi Arabia. Led by the 3rd Armored and 5th Mechanized Divisions, the Iraqi troops maintained a disciplined formation as they approached the Saudi town of Khafji, sneaking through a cleared path through the Saddam Line. Artillery units, equipped with powerful howitzers, were strategically positioned to provide supporting fire. The initial phase of the attack focused on overwhelming the sparse coalition outposts along the border. Marine forward air controllers, positioned to direct airstrikes, called in support while executing a tactical withdrawal as fast as possible. By midnight, the lead element of the Iraqi divisions were reaching the outskirts of Khafji. The city, abandoned months earlier due to its vulnerable position, was silent. The Iraqi grip on the town tightened as tanks and armored vehicles took up defensive positions, their barrels trained on potential entry points. Infantry squads methodically cleared buildings, setting up command posts and establishing communication lines. Unbeknownst to them, 12 U.S. Marines remained inside one of the buildings. As Khafji was being overrun by about 400 to 600 Iraqi troops and nearly 50 tanks, 2 6-man Marine reconnaissance teams conducting routine intelligence gathering inside the town found out about the ambush when they suddenly spotted the helmet of an Iraqi soldier showing above an approaching armored personnel carrier with machine guns at the ready. According to one Marine, quote, "All I saw was the helmet, then the shoulders, then the .50 caliber machine gun. I hit the ground and grabbed my Alice. then crawled to my Humvee. By the time the group determined they were surrounded, it was too late to leave, and the Marines sped south. From then, and until the town was liberated, the 12 trapped Marines had no choice but to hide in the upper floors of buildings, burn secret codes and other classified materials, and most importantly, use their encrypted radios to signal their locations and call in artillery fire on Iraqi positions. As January 29th ended, the Iraqi flag was raised over strategic locations. It was now official. Khafji was firmly in Iraqi hands. But this would not last for long. In the earliest hours of January 31st, 1991, as Iraqi troops invaded the tiny Saudi town, the United States Armed Forces were right in the midst of a 3-week redeployment, complicating the counterattack. Distressed by the occupation, Saudi Arabian Commander General Khaled bin Sultan appealed to U.S. General Norman Schwarzkopf for an immediate air campaign in and around the city. But the urban setting made it much too difficult. Instead, it was decided the coalition ground forces, including Marines, Saudis, and other allies, would retake the city with the support of a powerful air counterattack. Sensors detected Iraqi mechanized divisions entering Khafji, and air operations swiftly redirected their focus to target these moving forces. Using a system of strike areas, each measuring 18 miles by 18 miles, hundreds of air interdiction sorties, including over 100 Air Force A-10 missions, diverted their efforts to halt the advancing Iraqi forces. A-10s and A-6s joined forces, employing air-to-ground weapons to stop the Iraqi advance in its tracks. While the threats posed by anti-aircraft fire and missile launchers still remained, the rapid and concentrated air attacks prevented the assembly of heavier Iraqi air defenses. As the sun rose, only a few hundred Iraqi troops were occupying the town of Khafji. According to General Charles Horner, the Air Force's Joint Forces Air Component commander, quote, "So few Iraqis made it across the border that it appeared to be some sort of minor action." By the morning of January 30th, while it was clear that the Iraqis were slowing their advance, the coalition, particularly the U.S. Marines and Saudi forces, focused on regaining control over Khafji. However, to General Schwarzkopf, quote, "The mere fact that they had launched these attacks indicates they still have a lot of fight left in them." Throughout the day, air superiority continued to play a crucial role. Pilots quickly noticed that as soon as the first Iraqi vehicles got hit, the entire formation stopped moving, becoming much better targets. Toward evening, Saudi and Qatari forces assigned to the area began the first of 2 attacks to retake the town. Further supported by U.S. Marines, the ground efforts to push the Iraqi forces back finally began. As the coalition forces gradually advanced, no one shone brighter than the Saudi forces. Driven by the urgency and national pride to reclaim the territory, the Marines quickly gained confidence in their allies. According to Marine Liaison Officer Captain Joseph Malofsky, quote, "When push came to shove, without any real plan, any real direction, those Saudi soldiers obeyed their orders and went forward, and they did so courageously." With the offensive about 24 hours old, and with the powerful coalition moving faster than expected, Iraqi reinforcements made a push for Khafji under cover of darkness. However, joint stars detected the approaching Iraqi army and stopped, rerouted, delayed, and destroyed all enemy maneuvers with liberating vengeance. By the morning of January 31st, after exemplary coordination between air, artillery, and ground support of multiple nations, Iraq's entire offensive at Khafji had been mostly shut down. With the offensive unraveling, coalition efforts to reclaim the town intensified, beginning with a powerful artillery strike led by the U.S. Marine batteries at 7:05 a.m. Despite the heavy coalition bombardment, Iraqi forces maintained their positions in Khafji, resulting in fierce urban combat akin to the one fought on the night of the 29th. This was not without loss. A single U.S. Air Force AC-130, call sign Spirit 03, remained over its targets as the sun came up, despite the strict policy that these models only work at night. Just as was feared, an Iraqi surface-to-air missile struck the aircraft, taking down its entire 14-man crew with it, resulting in one of the largest losses of the entire Gulf War. Early on February 1st, the 12 Marines who had no choice but to hide within buildings were finally extracted from Khafji, and while one had suffered a shrapnel wound, all were alive. By then, the city had been recaptured. The 3-day ground conflict in and around Khafji involved some of the costliest firefights for American soldiers since Vietnam, leaving 43 coalition servicemen lost and 52 wounded. Iraqi army fatalities were reportedly in the multiple hundreds, while an estimated 500 more were captured as prisoners of war. While the Battle of Khafji did not accomplish any of the Iraqi objectives, it was enough of a success that Saddam was able to claim a credible propaganda victory. After all, despite the overwhelmingly superior coalition, the Iraqis did plan and execute a major surprise offensive, holding the town hostage for 2 whole days. According to Iraqi General Salah Aboud, quote, "The Khafji conflict is one of the bright spots in Iraqi army history, one of the many recorded for future generations." The Saudis, on the other side, were proud of their victory, especially their work with the incomparable United States Marines. As stated by General Khaled bin Sultan, quote, "They'd been given a chance to prove themselves, and had done so splendidly. Our forces were now equal partners with our allies, ready to play a full role in any future battle." After Khafji, the coalition leaders realized the Iraqi army wasn't as tough as they thought. It was clear the Iraqi soldiers had major morale issues and weren't really up for a fight. This gave the coalition a good idea of what kind of resistance they'd face when they launched their ground offensive later that month. As expected, Operation Desert Saber, which began on February 24th, was swift and smooth, with no significant counterattacks. To this day, the Battle of Khafji, a barely 3-day-long engagement, remains largely unknown due to the overshadowing impact of other major events in the Gulf War. On January 21, 1968, after months of gathering thousands of troops and supplies at the border with Laos, the North Vietnamese army surprised and encircled the isolated American base of Khe Sanh. There was no way in or out, but the devil dogs trusted each other, cleaned their rifles, and fixed their bayonets to get the job done. For over 77 days, the U.S. Marine garrison would fight against overwhelming odds without a single day of rest. The 6,000 Marines had to resist the violent push of over 16,000 NVA eager to overrun the base, and the Tet Offensive would be drained from men that could have been used elsewhere. Artillery bombardment, mortar fire, and airstrikes carrying explosives or napalm would lead to a deadly cacophony that tested the guts of the outnumbered Leathernecks. The siege of Khe Sanh ultimately became one of the longest and bloodiest battles of the Vietnam War. Khe Sanh was a village near the border with Laos and south of the DMZ, or Demilitarized Zone, divided into North and South Vietnam. During the 1960s, the village was the local seat of the government of the Bru Montagnard, a local tribe that made a living out of coffee plantations. In 1962, the United States Military Command Vietnam, or MACV, began building an Army Special Forces base near Khe Sanh. The purpose of the base was to train local men to fight against the northern communists and serve as a deterrent of enemy forces that sought to reach the city of Laos. From this base, the Army also launched patrols into Laos to conduct reconnaissance operations on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Then, in 1963, the Army built an airfield near an old French port. 3 years later, the U.S. Marines built their own base next to the Special Forces section, from where they would begin organizing their own operations in the region. Soon, the small Marine position was reinforced to regimental strength, as NVA, or North Vietnamese Army, activity increased in the surrounding hills. Operation Prairie 4 was then launched in April of 1967, followed by Operations Crockett and Ardmore. During this time, Marines and NVA firefights continually broke out to control the hillsides surrounding the Khe Sanh base. As October closed in, NVA activity and movement in the region dramatically increased. The communist forces began to gather and concentrate thousands of troops for a possible offensive. Artillery and ammunition depots and artillery pieces were sighted by intelligence forces, which alarmed the U.S. military command about a significant NVA threat around Khe Sanh. Still, some officers doubted that the communists would dare attack the U.S. forces when peace talks were already underway for the Tet talks. But others, like President Lyndon B. Johnson and General William Westmoreland, commander of the Military Assistance Command in Vietnam, believed otherwise. Both men considered that the NVA was deliberately targeting Khe Sanh and other South Vietnamese regions and cities to gain a political edge over the Americans for the upcoming peace talks. Westmoreland based his suspicions around what happened during the First Indochina War, in which the French were encircled and defeated at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954, giving the Vietnamese enough leverage to obtain their independence during the Geneva Peace Conference. Now, history could repeat itself. The NVA troops that surrounded Khasan comprised 2 infantry divisions and several artillery and armored regiments, and between 20,000 and 30,000 communist soldiers, including support troops, were rounded up in the vicinity. As the U.S. military command realized the extent of the offensive, they only had 2 options: abandon the base or reinforce it for an imminent attack. President Johnson and Westmoreland wanted the base to be held at all costs. In contrast, Maxwell Taylor, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and commander of the 101st Airborne during World War II, wanted the position to be abandoned due to its isolated location. In the end, the president's suggestion became an order, and Operation Scotland was launched to prepare the Marines for a possible NVA attack. The positions surrounding the base were then reinforced with supplies and men, and by January of 1968, 6,000 Marines and Army troops were entrenched and expecting an enemy attack soon. General Westmoreland also entertained the idea that if an all-out confrontation broke out near the demilitarized zone and Khasan was overrun, chemical or nuclear weapons could be used. Still, the few men that knew about this top-secret course of action hoped that the Marines could handle the defense with conventional weapons. Because of the timing and location, the only way to deploy more troops or supplies was through airdrops or helicopter landings, as the NVA had slowly surrounded the base from all flanks. Still, morale was high among the American soldiers, and they would need it as the air stiffened as the days went by. Then, on January 21st, 1968, the sky lit up. Havoc rained down from the sky as thousands of enemy artillery and mortar rounds began to pummel the isolated American base. It was time to fight. The massive artillery bombardment from the NVA was delivered with pinpoint accuracy. It was midnight, and although the Marines were on high alert, they were surprised by the sheer scale of the attack. While the Leathernecks raced for cover, the NVA launched a series of coordinated attacks from several positions. Then, at 3 a.m, the NVA's 6th Battalion attacked the Marines on Hill 861. An hour later, a second artillery barrage leveled most of the ground defenses that protected the base. Some of the shells hit the main ammunition dump and detonated most of the artillery and mortar rounds the Marines had stored, causing more damage inside the base. Even worse, another shell hit a stash of tear gas that saturated an entire area and forced the Marines to leave the area or fight with gas masks. 14 Marines were lost, and another 50 were wounded. Then, after the barrage was ceased, the NVA retreated. However, a series of explosives set around the base detonated before the Marines could breathe fresh air. To exacerbate the situation, the top brass was fooled by the communist forces by making them believe that most of their forces were centered around Khasan. But they were not. The NVA and Viet Cong launched over 70,000 men in a series of attacks that overran the entire DMZ on more than 100 different locations. It was the beginning of the Tet Offensive. The Army then sent Huey helicopters to support the outnumbered American and South Vietnamese personnel before evacuating them. For the following weeks, the Marines kept resisting at Khasan and its surrounding outposts, but the NVA never let them rest, and morale began to take a blow. In addition, ammunition and food soon began to run short, and aircraft delivering supplies were under constant heavy fire. The military command then launched Operation Niagara, a massive close air support campaign carried out by the 7th Air Force to support the Marines at Khasan and other nearby areas. Fighter aircraft and B-52 bombers dropped tons of explosives and napalm in the surrounding hills to force the NVA to retreat, but the enemy was relentless and kept coming back. Over 9,000 sorties were flown between January and March of 1968 and dropped more than 15,000 tons of bombs. By April, the combat strength of the NVA finally started to show signs of weakness after losing around 9,000 troops from the bombing campaign. But the fighting over Khasan was not over yet, and the Marines were still surrounded. After the success of Operation Niagara, Westmoreland ordered General John J. Johnson, commander of the 1st Cavalry Division, to begin planning Operation Pegasus. The operation's objective was to relieve the Marines at Khasan by weakening the NVA through a series of air and ground attacks along Route 9. Then, after some firefights, the Marines were able to move out from the base and extend the range of their patrols. In coordination with the air cavalry, the U.S. and South Vietnamese began to suffocate the pockets of resistance in the hills. A fierce campaign was eventually launched to decimate the NVA in the Ah Sha Valley, and in early June of 1968, the evacuation of Khasan began. Wounded Marines and soldiers were taken away, and undamaged equipment was picked up. The rest was destroyed or left behind. The last Marines were evacuated from Khasan on July 11th under cover of darkness. After 77 days of fighting, the base was finally abandoned. Although the NBA used the evacuation as a propaganda victory, statistics showed the contrary. While the U.S. death toll was less than 300, with 3,000 wounded, Communist forces surpassed 15,000 casualties, with 3,000 wounded. Still, the evacuation of Kazan helped fuel the anti-war sentiment back home. Eventually, President Johnson withdrew his candidacy for re-election, and Westmoreland was replaced by General Creighton W. Abrams to lead the MACV. The war would rage on for 7 more years. In the early 1990s, the Somali Civil War tore the country apart and brought starvation to millions of people. Dozens of countries, including the United States, attempted to bring supplies to Somali civilians, but their efforts were halted by local gangs, even as the UN stepped in with an emergency resolution. After American soldiers arrived at the war-torn country in 1992 as part of a peaceful humanitarian mission to ensure the resources' safe delivery, they were attacked by warlord Mohammed Farah Aidid and his forces. The once peaceful mission's purpose then evolved to an attempt to seize 2 of Mohammed Farah Aidid's top men, triggering the Battle of Mogadishu. A smooth and simple operation that was supposed to take no longer than an hour ended up as a high-risk rescue mission that lasted overnight. The Somali rebel forces were armed with rocket-propelled grenades, and they had America's Black Hawk helicopters in their sights. In January 1991, the Somali government was overthrown by a coalition of opposing clans. A catastrophic civil war ensued, and it still persists 30 years later. When the Somali National Army disbanded after the coup, some soldiers reassembled as irregular regional forces, while others joined the clan militias. The leading rebel group situated in Mogadishu, the country's capital, was the United Somali Congress. It was later divided into 2 separate factions. One was led by Ali Mahdi Mohammed, who became the president, and the other by Mohammed Farah Aidid. 4 opposition groups wrangled for political influence and supremacy. After 6 months of vicious fighting, they agreed to a ceasefire, but it did not hold. A 5th group emerged, the Somali National Movement. They declared their independence on the country's northwestern side. The new movement renamed its territory as Somaliland and selected its leader, Abdurrahman Ahmed Ali Tour, as their new president. The fighting continued well into the fall. By September 1991, over 20,000 people had lost their lives, many more were injured, and hundreds of thousands of families had lost their homes. The merciless civil war destroyed Somalia's agricultural supply chain, which led to mass starvation. The international community became aware of Somalia's famine, and governments from across the globe began to send food supplies. However, close to 80% of the supplies were hijacked and brought to clan leaders, who exchanged them for weapons. Over 300,000 victims succumbed to starvation from 1991 to 92, despite the aid program. The United Nations Security Council stepped in, and Resolution 794 was unanimously approved on December 3, 1992. The Council expressed pressing concern for the African country. The UN authorized the Unified Task Force's creation of a secure environment for humanitarian relief operations to ensure that supplies would be delivered to the civilian population. In July 1992, the United Nations sent 50 military observers to oversee the food's distribution after a ceasefire between the clans. U.S. President George H.W. Bush announced that American military transports would be sent to Somalia to support Resolution 794. 10 Lockheed C-130 Hercules aircraft and 400 American soldiers were deployed to Mombasa, Kenya. The objective was to airlift aid to Somalia's most remote areas, as truck convoys were more likely to be hijacked. The transport aircraft successfully delivered 48,000 tons of medical supplies and food to humanitarian organizations in Somalia. By December of 1992, the Somalian emergency had only gotten worse. The U.S. launched a coalition operation to assist and protect humanitarian activities in the country. Codenamed Operation Restore Hope, the Unified Task Force, or UNITAF, assumed command of an international team to ensure a safe environment for humanitarian operations in Somalia's southern region. Although most UNITAF personnel were American, other countries, including Australia, Canada, Belgium, Germany, France, India, Spain, the United Arab Emirates, and the United Kingdom also contributed to the cause. Somali warlord Mohammed Farah Aidid regarded the United Nations missions as hostile. In June 1993, his clan ambushed a peacekeeping convoy. 4 American military police officers lost their lives. After the incident, U.S. Admiral Jonathan Howe declared Aidid an outlaw, and the faction's forces targeted the American officer. The once peaceful Operation Restore Hope had to change course. U.S. forces would be dispatched to seize 2 of Aidid's top brass lieutenants, Foreign Minister Omar Saad El-Mim and Chief Political Advisor Mohammed Hassan Awale. The mission, now codenamed Operation Gothic Serpent, was commanded by General William Garrison of the U.S. Joint Special Operations Command. His task force included the 3rd Battalion 75th Ranger Regiment, the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, and Delta Force operators. The plan was to surround a 3-story residential building in Mogadishu, where intel showed that Aidid's Habar Gadir clans leaders were meeting. Soldiers would carry the attack using MH-6 Little Bird helicopters and secure the targets inside. Rangers would then fly into the area in MH-60L Black Hawk helicopters, fast rope down, and surround the building. A secure defensive perimeter needed to be established so that no members of Aidid's militia could get in or out. A ground convoy of 9 high-mobility multi-purpose wheeled vehicles, or Humvees, and 3 M939 5-ton trucks would arrive to subtract the troops and take the Somali prisoners back to the American base. The entire operation would involve 19 aircraft, 12 vehicles, and around 160 troops. It was also intended to last less than an hour. In reality, almost nothing went as planned. At 1350 hours on October 3, 1993, Task Force Ranger analysts received intel on Foreign Minister Omar Saad El-Mim's location. The soldiers were on standby and waited for code word Irene to be echoed on the radio channels as the signal to send their helicopters into the air. When the Little Bird helicopters hit the target building at 1542 hours, the dust cloud from the fire was so dense that one aircraft was forced to go around the area again and land out of its planned location. The 2 Black Hawk helicopters carrying the 2nd Delta Assault Team, led by Captain Austin Miller, came into position. The 4 Ranger trucks prepared to rope down onto the 4 sides of the building. One of the helicopters accidentally landed a block north of the target. The team inside attempted to move down to the intended position, but ground fire prevented them from doing so. Private First Class Todd Blackburn fell while roping down from a Black Hawk hovering 70 feet above the Somali streets. He suffered substantial injuries and required evacuation. The ground convoy arrived 10 minutes later near the target building and waited for the Delta and Ranger soldiers to complete the mission. Enemy resistance proved more fierce than expected. Somali forces shot down 2 American Black Hawk helicopters using RPG-7s, a portable, shoulder-launched anti-tank rocket-propelled grenade launcher. Defending the downed Black Hawks became a priority. Aidid's aides, Omar Saad El-Mim and Mohammed Hassan Awale, were now in custody, but their captors were soon pinned down as they struggled to secure the 2 downed aircraft. The initial ground convoy was repelled, and they had no choice but to move back. There was no contingency plan, but a relief convoy hastily assembled a 2-mile-long column and headed back into the fight. About 90 U.S. Rangers and Delta Force operators were caught in an intense gunfire exchange and trapped overnight. The mission became an 18-hour ordeal. During a long, sleepless night, clusters of tired soldiers nursed wounded comrades and held their perimeters against Aidid's gunmen. As the sun went down, water and ammunition ran low, and the men had not brought their night vision devices. They had no choice but to stay put until relief arrived. Finally, after daybreak, a team of American, Malaysian, and Pakistani rescuers extricated the soldiers, along with the captured opponents. After the Battle of Mogadishu, angry Somalians shot videos of the perished American soldiers being dragged through the streets. The images were seen around the world, causing international outrage. Downed pilot Mike Durant was captured and held for 10 days by the Habar Gadir clan. On March 31, 1994, President Bill Clinton put a halt to the mission and ordered the Special Forces to retreat. Delta Team snipers Gary Gordon and Randy Shugart were posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for their heroic actions in trying to rescue the pilot. Black Hawk Down left 18 American casualties and many more wounded. It's estimated that Somali fatalities range from 350 to 1,000, depending on the source. For Somali civilians, the consequences were severe. The civil war continued to shred the country into pieces. Even after Aidid was killed in 1996, Somalia remained dangerous and lawless for decades. Pirate gangs along Somalia's Indian Ocean coastline threatened vital shipping lanes. Many Somalis have fled the country, but the poor have suffered the most. The United States would be wary of deploying ground forces to a foreign land for years to come, but this isolationist stand changed after the September 11, 2001 attack on the country. As Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama sent troops to Iraq and Afghanistan, they still kept their distance from Islamic insurgents in Somalia. The Battle of Mogadishu was a victory, but won at a great cost. The American Special Forces operators at Camp Nam Dong knew that the Viet Cong would attack their outpost sooner rather than later. They just didn't know when. In early July of 1964, several confrontations had escalated to full-fledged warfare. Innocent villagers were attacked by communist aficionados, entire farms were destroyed and left to rot, and combat patrols from around the area reported countless ominous signs. Then, at 2 a.m. on July 5th, 12 Green Beret instructors and their Vietnamese trainees received their baptism in fire when over 1,000 Viet Cong guerrillas surrounded their base and went after them. The odds were not in their favor, and it was up to Captain Roger Donlin to push his men to the limit until air support arrived. While the Americans and the South Koreans were fighting the Communists beyond the 38th parallel in the Korean Peninsula in 1952, the war in Vietnam was coming to an end in favor of the Marxist sympathizers of Ho Chi Minh. The seasoned French veterans of World War II and their ex-Waffen-SS German compatriots of the French Foreign Legion were then forced to leave the country after the decisive Battle of Dien Bien Phu. Vietnam was no longer a French colony after 1954. Still, the Vietnamese population was divided. Some locals became fervent followers of the Marxist ideology, while others opted for democracy and the Western way of life inherited by the French occupation. A civil war eventually broke out, and South Korea was the first to offer support to fend off the spread of communism. Still, President Syngman Rhee's military offering was refused to prevent further escalation. Meanwhile, the United States did its best to support the Vietnamese Republic with weapons, vehicles, and supplies, following its domino theory. In the early 1960s, President Kennedy repeatedly refused military intervention in Vietnam. He believed that civil unrest in the countryside could be solved through peaceful means. At the time, the president could not afford to have a presence in Vietnam and only approved sending highly trained military advisors to assist the Vietnamese armed forces. Kennedy observed that, quote, "To introduce U.S. forces in large numbers there today, while it might have an initially favorable military impact, would almost certainly lead to adverse political and, in the long run, adverse military consequences." Still, advisor John Kenneth Galbraith warned Kennedy of the, quote, "danger we shall replace the French as a colonial force in the area and bleed as the French did." Kenneth's words became prophetic, and after Kennedy's assassination in November of 1963, the war in Vietnam drastically escalated. However, President Lyndon B. Johnson adopted a policy of foreign participation in the war and wrote to several world leaders to ask for their support in the upcoming conflict as part of the Many Flags Initiative. The Free World Military Assistance Forces were then formed, sending troops from South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, the Philippines, and even Spain. Meanwhile, the American military advisors in Vietnam were on their own against a numerically superior and ruthless opponent, the Viet Cong guerrilla, and one of the first outposts to witness the brunt of the communist forces was Camp Nam Dong. Camp Nam Dong was purposely erected on a significant route employed by the North Vietnamese to deter enemy forces in the area. The camp was located about 30 miles west of Da Nang and about 15 miles near the border with Laos. It was a U.S. Special Forces center. 30-year-old Special Forces Captain Roger Donlin arrived in the area in May of 1964 to build the outpost with the help of 12 Green Berets, Australian warrant officer Kevin Conway, and American anthropologist Gerard Hickey, who was studying local indigenous tribes. Donlin and his men were tasked with training 60 Nung, or ethnic Chinese mercenaries, at the camp, around 300 Katu tribesmen and a Vietnamese Special Forces unit. Camp Nam Dong was strategically placed on the highest point of the valley and comprised over 5 acres. The American and the Nung mercenaries controlled the inner perimeter, while the Vietnamese forces and the tribesmen guarded the outer compound. Although the outpost was lightly defended, it had everything it needed to put up a fight against an approaching enemy force, with 3 mortar positions and several machine gun emplacements. From the beginning, Donlin and the Green Berets noticed that the area was infested with communist sympathizers. 1 month after setting up the base, some of the Green Berets had already figured out that there were traitors and spies among their ranks. Still, the Americans put a significant effort into convincing them to fight the good fight, an error that would cost many lives later on. On July 3, 1964, Donlin was inspecting the defenses and the mortar positions when he got a message by radio. It was from Special Forces Team A726, which was on patrol near the region. Sergeant Michael Disser said, quote, "The villagers are scared, and they won't tell me or my interpreters why." Rumors of an imminent Viet Cong attack had been running loose in the surroundings of Camp Nam Dong for days, and Disser's account was one of many. Several other Green Berets had also reported strange occurrences. During another patrol, South Vietnamese forces found the bodies of several friendly village chiefs that were murdered by communist sympathizers, while the owners of small farms had been disappearing in the middle of the night along with their valuable stock. A cloud of mystery was brewing in the valley, and the Green Berets knew something was coming. Then, at noon on July 4th, the Nung mercenaries, considered the Americans' bodyguards, confronted Vietnamese military members after alleged rumors of a communist victory. Hours later, one of the Green Berets, Staff Sergeant Merwin Woods, wrote in a letter to his wife, quote, "All hell's going to break loose here before the night is over." At around 2:30 a.m. on July 5th, Donlin got ready to relieve his Australian compatriot Kevin Conway from duty. Then, as he was about to enter the mess hall to get some coffee, the roof exploded with an unbearable flash. Donlin was knocked to the ground, and when he got up, hell had already been unleashed around him. Fire, mortars, and calls for help immediately filled the ambience, with Master Sergeant Gabriel Ralph Alamo and Staff Sergeant Keith Daniels on the phone calling for an urgent airstrike. Seconds later, the room was blown to pieces by a mortar strike, but the 3 Green Berets managed to get out on time. The base was now under full attack, and the soldiers were in position, but they could not see the enemy. Then, as Donlin, Alamo, and Daniels reached for weapons and ammunition at the command post, another Green Beret launched a flare. What they saw was alarming. Over 900 Viet Cong were approaching to break through the perimeter. The team's medic, Sergeant Thomas Gregg, raced to the gate area and finished off 3 men with his pump-action shotgun. Then, after distributing ammunition and grenades to his Nungs, Donlin realized that the traitors among the ranks had attacked some of his comrades during their sleep before the onslaught. The fight continued, and several Americans manned the 3 mortars with accurate and lethal fire, but the swarm of enemies kept coming. Conway was then fatally wounded between the eyes while urging the remaining Vietnamese soldiers to hold their positions, and after lingering for an hour, he became the first Australian casualty of the Vietnam War. Donlin went from cover to cover to inspire his men and concentrate their fire on the Viet Cong. He then heard that one of his men, Sergeant John Houston, was running out of ammunition and rushed to his side, but was caught by a mortar round that knocked him down, losing one of his boots and rifle bandoliers. Houston was then overrun by Viet Cong. Captain Donlin was now wounded by 3 direct hits, including one to his stomach. Still, he refused medical treatment and kept rallying his men. With the outer perimeter now breached, it was up to the Chinese Nungs to hold the inner perimeter while the Americans fired their mortars. Alamo then fired his M79 grenade launcher directly at the main gate from which the enemy was coming, but it was not enough. The men then moved towards the inner defenses and desperately tried to cover Alamo when a mortar round exploded between them. Master Sergeant Alamo instantly perished, while Donlin was wounded a 4th time. Still, he got up and made his way towards woods, where he helped fire one of the mortars. At 4 a.m., after almost 3 hours of relentless fighting, and just when they were about to be overrun, the Americans heard approaching aircraft. It was the flare ship. The Viet Cong knew that a flare ship always anticipated an airstrike, so they quickly took cover. The Americans and their allies then heard a loudspeaker through which someone was shouting, quote, "Lay down your weapons. We're going to annihilate your camp. You will all be killed." A mortarman then pinpointed the location from which the noise was coming and fired 10 quick rounds, silencing the enemy speaker. The fighting continued until 6 a.m., when air support finally arrived to finish off the remaining Viet Cong. In the end, over 170 enemy bodies were scattered across the base, and many more were wounded. while 60 South Vietnamese lost their lives, along with Alamo, Houston, and Conway. Captain Roger Donlin was eventually awarded the First Medal of Honor of the Vietnam War, and his citation reads, quote, "His dynamic leadership, fortitude, and valiant efforts inspired not only the American personnel, but the friendly Vietnamese defenders as well, and resulted in the successful defense of the camp." Captain Donlin's extraordinary heroism, at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, are in the highest traditions of the U.S. Army and reflect great credit upon himself and the armed forces of his country. Early in the afternoon on May 3, 1945, a Yugoslavian prisoner named Zvonimir Kukovic left the gates of Austria's Itter Castle, the looming fortress on a hill where he was being held by Nazi SS guards, and bicycled into the thick forests beyond. He was supposed to be running an errand for the prison's commander, Sebastian Wimmer, a not infrequent occurrence, as Kukovic had earned the Nazi commander's trust as a maintenance man and electrician who had helped convert the castle into a German prison. But Kukovic had an ulterior motive that afternoon. He was carrying a contraband note written by English-speaking prisoners inside. He had agreed to take the note out of prison and present it to the first group of American soldiers he encountered. And so, instead of running the errand and returning to the castle, as he usually did, he continued riding. Kukovic considered making the short ride west to Virgil, a small city close to the German-Austrian border. But the town was still densely occupied by German troops, and so instead, he made the much longer trip to Innsbruck, riding over 40 miles along the Inn River Valley. He reached the city that evening, where he succeeded in tracking down a group of Americans, the 409th Infantry Regiment of the American 103rd Infantry Division, and passed on his note. The unit did not have the authorization to move forward with the rescue attempt themselves, but they promised Kukovic a definitive answer from their headquarters by the next morning. What followed is one of the more extraordinary and unlikely stories of World War II. The story of an American Army commander working together with his enemy, an SS captain and a Wehrmacht major, to lead a mixed company of American and German troops to an Austrian castle and rescue a group of French political prisoners. What is now known as the Battle for Castle Itter. Itter Castle sits atop a hill overlooking the village of Itter to the east, in the Austrian state of Tyrol. The castle sits at the entrance to Austria's picturesque Brixen Valley, a site where some manner of fortress had existed since the 11th century. The modern iteration of the castle was built in 1878, atop the foundation of its predecessor. In 1925, the castle was purchased by the wealthy aristocrat Dr. Franz Grüne, the deputy governor of the surrounding state of Tyrol. He used the spacious estate primarily as a place to house his sizable collection of artwork and sculptures. After the Anschluss in March of 1938, in which Austria was forcibly annexed by Nazi Germany, the country was divided into 7 districts, with Itter and the rest of Tyrol governed by a provincial Nazi government stationed in Vorarlberg, 90 miles to the southwest. Itter Castle, or Schloss Itter, as it was called in German, was officially leased from Dr. Grüne by the Nazis. At first, the castle was mostly left alone during the first months of German occupation. The SS and the Wehrmacht, Germany's massive unified army, were more focused on stamping out any semblance of Austrian independence elsewhere and devouring the country as a whole into their empire. The German war effort depended on the rapid expansion of their armed forces by assimilating young men from every country they conquered. Within days of the Anschluss, the entire Austrian army was consolidated into the Wehrmacht. Some Austrian soldiers served the Nazi cause willingly, even enthusiastically, but many others accepted their orders only as a last resort to avoid the punishment of death. Small Austrian resistance groups persisted throughout the occupation, both in larger cities like Vienna and in towns like Virgil. Though German recruitment efforts attempted to weed out any Austrian soldiers considered to be political liabilities, many young men who privately despised the Nazis ended up in their ranks, where they learned of the military strategies being employed by Wehrmacht commanders up close. In a parallel effort, a branch of the Nazis' Waffen-SS, the party's branded police force, had been operating in secret in Austria since 1934. Their primary objective was to identify and flag any Austrians who were anticipated to resist occupation or otherwise present a threat. This effort paved the way for the oncoming Anschluss. Dissidents, nationalists, leftists, and others were rounded up, leading Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS and one of Hitler's most trusted advisors, to the realization that the Wehrmacht would require secure sites in Austria to temporarily house these political prisoners until they could be transported to German prisons and concentration camps. Itter Castle's strategic position, along with its thick walls, dry moat, and large gatehouse, made it an ideal venue for a prison. After a brief period in which the castle was being used as a headquarters for Hitler's anti-tobacco campaign, the German alliance for combating the dangers of tobacco, Himmler set his sights on the castle and requested that it be acquired permanently for, quote, special SS use. On February 7, 1943, SS Lieutenant General Oswald Pohl, under direct orders from Himmler, suddenly terminated the lease agreement with the castle's owner, Dr. Grune, and seized the property outright with the intent of quickly converting it into a large Nazi holding cell. The project was spearheaded by Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, who designated SS Second Lieutenant Petz to remain on site and oversee construction. Petz arrived at the castle on February 8, 1943, with 27 prisoners, both from Dachau and the Flossenburg camps, to act as his labor force. Over the following months, the castle was gutted and transformed into a prison camp, its guest rooms converted into cells and offices for SS brass, its various entrances and exits thoroughly escape-proofed. The project was completed on April 25, 1943, and Petz departed, taking most of his prisoner workforce with him back to Dachau. Only 2 guards and an electrical worker, Zvonimir Kukovic, were left behind to finish odds and ends of the job. Kukovic was a 36-year-old Croatian who had made his living as an electrical technician before the German invasion of Yugoslavia in April 1941. After the attack, he joined a Yugoslav anti-Nazi resistance group, the National Liberation Army, but was arrested by the Gestapo in December 1941. He spent time in several Nazi prison camps before ending up in Dachau in September of 1942. His proficiency as an electrician saved him from being executed, and he was added to the camp's maintenance crew, under Petz's supervision, which is how he eventually wound up at Itter Castle the following year. The newly opened Itter prison's operations were placed under the authority of the Dachau concentration camp in southwest Germany, 90 miles northwest from Itter. 15 members of Dachau's SS unit were relocated to the castle to form the prison's guard force. Command of the castle was awarded to SS Captain Sebastian Wimmer, a native Bavarian who had made a name for himself overseeing the Majdanek concentration camp in Poland. Wimmer was notoriously sadistic and unpredictable, and prone to flying into drunken rages. Many who knew him labeled him a sociopath, but he was useful in streamlining his cruelty to get results. Wimmer, upon arrival, attempted to whip the newly formed guard force into shape. He implemented surprise inspections and escape drills to prepare, all of which Kukovic observed with interest from his cell, recording notes in a contraband notebook he had stolen from the SS guard room. On May 2, 1943, Kukovic watched from his cell as 2 Mercedes cars with SS flags attached arrived outside the castle gates, and 3 men exited the first car. Kukovic was shocked to realize he recognized all 3: Edouard Daladier, General Maurice Gamelin, and Léon Jouot, 3 of the most prominent members of the French resistance, who would become the first of several VIP prisoners to be rounded up and held hostage at Itter Castle. Alongside Austrian dissidents and radicals, the newly minted Itter prison also housed several prominent French detainees, many of the leaders in the French resistance, considered to be of high strategic value to the Nazis as bargaining chips. These high-profile prisoners included tennis star Jean Barota, 2 former prime ministers, 3 former commanders-in-chief, and Marie-Agnes Caillot, the sister of French resistance leader Charles de Gaulle. The prisoners themselves represented several different interests and political ideologies. They tended to separate into 3 groups for meals to keep from fighting. As far as quality of life, the prisoners held at Itter Castle had it much better than other Nazi-controlled prisons and camps. They were given serviceable meals, exercise time in an open courtyard, and access to the prison library. Many of the Wehrmacht guards also regarded them differently than other Nazi prisoners, a difference which became remarkably more pronounced as the war tilted in favor of the Allies. Meanwhile, it turned out that the commander of Dachau camp at the time, Eduard Weiter, had fled before the camp's ultimate liberation and arrived at Itter Castle on May 2, 1945. He died that night under mysterious circumstances, though according to Paul Renaud, a former French prime minister being held prisoner at Itter, Weiter had spent the night drunkenly bragging about the atrocities he had committed at Dachau before ultimately shooting and killing himself. The next day, on May 3rd, the French prisoners received word via a hidden radio that American troops were pushing into the Tyrol area, specifically the town of Innsbruck. The former political leaders among them decided that their best option would be to try and contact the Americans. That afternoon, Zvonimir Kukovic departed the castle on a bicycle with the secret mission of securing American aid. By nightfall, morale among the castle's guard staff had eroded. Following both Edward Viter's mysterious death the night prior and Kukovic's failure to return from his errand, Wimmer gave up and fled his command post, fearing for his own life. The SS guards that remained there soon followed suit, leaving the prisoners to take control of the castle, arming themselves with makeshift weapons found throughout the castle grounds. They did not dare leave the castle, however, because they weren't sure of the situation in the surrounding area, or how much of Tyrol was still actively under Nazi control. Instead, they hung a French flag from the castle's exterior to signal to Allied air forces who was inside and avoid attacks. Because Kukovic had not yet returned, and they could not be sure if the word had gotten to the Americans, the prisoners sent another carrier out the next day, May 4th. This time, they chose their Czech cook, a man named Andreas Krobot, to ride to Virgil on a bicycle belonging to the guards with another note from inside the prison. Virgil had recently been liberated from Wehrmacht control when the majority of its discouraged Wehrmacht forces abandoned their posts, though roaming packs of SS soldiers still patrolled the area and would open fire on any house flying Austrian flags. Krobot succeeded in locating the Austrian resistance forces in the town without detection from the SS and was taken to their commander, Major Josef Gengel. Gengel was an officer in the Wehrmacht who had, like many, become disillusioned with his position. The rash actions of lingering SS troops in Virgil towards the local civilians had been the last straw, and he had officially broken his ties to the German army. In addition, he reached out to the local resistance and offered to rearm them with Wehrmacht supplies and weaponry, an act of treason that would be punishable by death. He was made the head of the resistance group in Virgil due to his experience and leadership. By the time he met with Krobot, Gengel already knew of the situation at the castle. When Krobot informed him that Wimmer and the remaining guards had abandoned the prison, Gengel was emboldened and began considering a rescue mission himself. But he could not leave the town of Virgil and its civilians unguarded, and he worried that once he reached the castle, he would not be able to hold it or protect its prisoners from an SS assault. Instead, Gengel decided to make a plea to the Americans. He had received word that American forces had reached the town of Kufstein, 8 miles to the north. Gengel drove to the town, revealing a white flag of surrender when he was close enough to be seen by the American forces. In Kufstein, Gengel met with 27-year-old Captain Lee, commander of the 23rd Tank Battalion, 12th Armored Division. Lee and his troops had hoped that taking Kufstein would be their last battle, as they knew the war was winding down, and they planned to wait there until they could be relieved by the 36th Infantry Division. When Gengel sat down with Captain Lee and explained the situation at the castle, Lee quickly volunteered to spearhead a rescue mission, quickly radioing to receive permission from his commanders. Lee knew that he didn't have enough vehicles to safely escort all of the prisoners out of the castle and carry them back to Kufstein, so he planned instead to help the prisoners hold the castle from SS attacks until American reinforcements from the 142nd Battalion could search the area and snuff out the SS threat altogether. Lee and Gengel drove to the castle together in Gengel's military vehicle. They were followed by reinforcements from Lee's tank division. However, they were forced to turn back at a bridge that appeared too weak to support their weight. 14 American soldiers from Lee's division, a driver, and a truck with 10 former Wehrmacht riflemen pressed onward towards the castle. 4 miles from the castle gates, the small company encountered a party of roaming SS troops attempting to set up a barrier to block the road to the castle. A firefight ensued, and the company led by Lee and Gengel quickly persevered. Back behind castle walls, the lingering prisoners had also enlisted help from strange bedfellows. They had asked Kurt Siegfried Schrader, an SS officer stationed at the prison, whom they had come to know and trust as a defector from the Nazi cause, to head the castle's meager defense forces, sensing that an SS attack was coming. Lee and Gengel arrived at the castle and assessed the situation, finding a strange company of German defectors, French political prisoners, and Austrian resistance members all on the same side with Schrader, a man in an SS officer's uniform. The friendly German troops within the castle were asked to wear strips of black cloth around their arms so that they would be distinguishable from the hostile Germans. The SS troops arrived, but did not immediately launch any sort of full-scale attack. Instead, they circled the castle's perimeter, seemingly probing for a weak spot. The Germans who had sided with the prisoners inside risked being killed for treason if they were defeated by the SS, and one of the resistance Germans indeed fled in a panic from within the castle over its walls and into the surrounding forest where the SS had set up several strongpoints. This incident caused Lee to worry about the reliability of the remaining German soldiers, but Gengel convinced him to let them keep their weapons. Lee and Gengel joined Schrader in the top level of the keep, where the three leaders could see over 100 SS troops swarming in the surrounding woods in setting up heavy ammunition guns aimed at the castle. Using a telephone in the castle, Gengel was able to reach Alois Mayer, his fellow resistance leader in Virgil, to warn of the heavy SS presence around the castle and to request additional reinforcements. 2 more German defector soldiers and a young Austrian resistance member, Hans Waltel, were rapidly transported from the town to the castle to aid in the standoff. At 10 that morning, the fighting began in earnest. Lee's own personal tank, which he had nicknamed Besotten Jenny, was positioned defensively in front of the castle's main gate. It began taking heavy rounds from a German SS gun. The 3 men assigned to it, including the technician inside attempting to fix its radio, managed to survive the attack and withdraw into the castle. It quickly became a question of how long the ragtag resistance unit could hold on before running out of munitions. Luckily, they had the castle's construction on their side. If the SS troops managed to scale or destroy the fortress's exterior walls, they could withdraw to its central armored keep and continue to fire from strategic positions within. The women and children among the prisoners were safely sheltered in the castle's cellar, but several of the men among them remained above ground in the courtyard to protect the basement from any oncoming attackers. Captain Lee, aware that he had not been able to give the 142nd Division a full picture of the enemy forces they would face, wanted to get word to the approaching reinforcements as quickly as possible so they would not be ambushed outside the castle gates. Because his tank radio was down and all other communication methods had been severed, French prisoner Jean Barotre, the famous tennis star of the 1920s and 30s, volunteered to deliver the message in person using his stealth and athleticism. Barotre vaulted the castle walls and ran full steam through an obstacle course of SS footholds throughout the forest to reach the 142nd and give them a full debrief of the situation up at the castle. He then requested an American Army uniform and joined the marching troops back up through the forest toward the castle. The long-awaited relief force arrived at the castle at 4 in the afternoon, and with their help, the remaining SS forces were quickly extinguished. Over 100 loyal SS soldiers were taken alive as prisoners of war. The French prisoners inside the castle were evacuated that evening, arriving back in Paris on May 10th. The strange, tangled-up battle for Castle Itter was over. 2 days later, Germany signed its unconditional surrender, bringing the European theater of the war to a close. Though an accurate death count is not known for the battle, it is understood that several Wehrmacht defectors were injured or killed by SS fire, in the process of aiding or assisting the Nazi resistance. Gengel himself died during the battle from a sniper's bullet sustained while attempting to shield French Prime Minister Renaud when pulling him out of harm's way. He was honored as an Austrian national hero, and a street in Virgil was named after him. When U.S. forces approached the tiny island of Peleliu inside the Japanese National Defense Zone in late 1944, the Imperial Japanese High Command was determined to defend the small landmass at any cost. By then, the Empire was strictly on the defensive, as their forces had suffered blow after blow, while they slowly retreated to their country. A regiment of 10,000 men, belonging to one of Japan's most experienced and capable regiments, the 14th Infantry Division, was sent to reinforce Peleliu. Their instructions were to hold the islands with their lives, and they were prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice to halt the American incursion. Meanwhile, American forces composed of the 1st, 5th, and 7th Marine Regiments were ordered to take the island and capture its runway at all costs, as it was one of the most essential airstrips in Asia. As the Americans landed in Peleliu, expecting a weakened Japanese force, they had no idea that the enemy had reorganized and switched tactics entirely, turning into what became known as the bitterest fight for the Marines in World War II. By late February of 1944, the Allied forces advanced successfully through the Pacific, capturing the Marshall Islands and moving on to the Marianas, where 20,000 U.S. troops landed on Saipan on June 15th. After a fierce battle where the Japanese offered an outstanding resistance, Saipan was finally under Allied control by July 9th, and the neighboring Tinian and Guam Islands were also captured by late August. Japan was losing ground fast, as the Allies had penetrated their so-called absolute national defense zone. Consequently, their commanders were becoming more desperate and ruthless week after week, and soon began embracing suicide attacks as their inability to hold back the Allies by traditional military means became more evident. Following their streak of victories, the The next objective for Admiral Chester Nimitz's Pacific Fleet was the Palau Islands in the Western Carolines, roughly 500 miles east of the Philippines. The first island that needed to be captured was Peleliu, a tiny area with only 5 square miles of land. Taking Peleliu was deemed a critical objective for the Allied war effort, as it was the location of one of the largest airstrips in the region and could be used by the Japanese to send aerial raids to the islands around it. If the Allies wanted to liberate the Philippines from Japanese control, they needed to disable the airstrip first. In 1944, Peleliu was occupied by about 10,000 Japanese soldiers of the 14th Infantry Division, led by Colonel Kunio Nakagawa. The island had been systematically reinforced and fortified for several months now, and the Japanese servicemen were well armed with 81mm and 150mm mortars and 20mm anti-aircraft cannons. They were also supported by light tank and anti-aircraft units. After the devastating defeats in the Solomons, Gilberts, Marshalls, and Marianas Islands, the Imperial Army researched new defense tactics. They then decided to abandon the previous strategy of attempting to stop the Allies on the beaches where they would be vulnerable to naval gunfire. The new strategy entailed disrupting the landings at the water's edge to then execute primary defensive operations further into the islands. Colonel Nakagawa used the island's rugged terrain to his advantage and converted the numerous cave systems within the landmass into an intricate honeycomb system of bunkers and fortified positions, essentially creating a massive fortification out of the natural terrain. Japanese engineers also installed reinforced steel doors in the natural tunnels connecting the caves and built slanted cave entrances to prevent grenade and flamethrower attacks. Nakagawa also used the high ground to his advantage, concentrating his defensive forces on the island's highest point, Umurbrogol Mountain. This collection of mountains and hills gave the Japanese a clear view of many of the beaches and allowed them to defend the precious airstrip from above. Meanwhile, the beaches were crammed with thousands of obstacles for the landing craft, mainly mines and several heavy artillery shells that would explode when run over. A battalion was also placed on the beach to delay the inevitable American advance inland, where the real defenses were set up. On the other hand, the U.S. was determined to capture Peleliu, and in September of 1944, they began sending over 17,000 members of the Marine 1st Division to the island. Like the elite Japanese troops garrisoned there, the chosen U.S. forces were among the Marine Corps' best-trained troops. The invasion would also be supported by several battleships, heavy cruisers, and light cruisers that would rain fire over enemy defenses before the landing occurred. The Marines were led by Major General William Rupertus, who was highly confident in their ability to claim the island swiftly, even going as far as saying that they would not need more than 3 days to capture it. However, the U.S. forces had no idea that the Japanese had shifted their tactics, and they planned to go into the island employing the same strategy that they had used in several amphibious attacks before. By the time the first American troops landed on September 15th, U.S. naval support had already bombarded several locations on the island for 3 days. The preemptive strikes had been focused on the beaches, as that was where Japanese forces tended to concentrate their defensive efforts in the past. As the Marines descended from their landing craft, they were immediately engaged in a crossfire as the Japanese opened the steel doors guarding their posts and began to fire. The artillery came from both flanks, with 47mm guns and 20mm cannons, destroying 60 tracked landing and amphibious vehicles in 1 hour. As another group of Marines descended into what was dubbed Orange Beach, Colonel Chesty Puller barely escaped when a dud high-velocity artillery round struck his landing vehicle. Meanwhile, his communications unit was also destroyed on its way to the beach by a 47mm round. Covered by coconut groves, the 5th Marines made the most progress on the first day, successfully pushing toward the island's airfield. Still, they were soon met by a massive counterattack, as Nakagawa's armored tank company rushed across the airfield to repel the Marines. The Americans then returned the fire, and the effort was quickly overwhelmed by U.S. tanks, howitzers, naval guns, and dive bombers. As the sun settled in the distance, the Americans held most of the beaches, but little else. By then, the Marines had suffered 200 casualties and 900 injuries, but Rupertus was still confident that the Japanese would quickly crumble. On the second day, the 5th Marines moved to take the airfield and push towards the eastern shore. They then approached the airport while sustaining heavy artillery fire from the highlands to the north, resulting in several casualties. Still, the Japanese were not the only ones inflicting heavy damage. Temperatures surpassing 115 degrees Fahrenheit were causing many soldiers to perish due to heat exhaustion as they attempted to overwhelm Japanese positions. To make matters worse, the water supply became compromised after it was delivered in contaminated oil drums, increasing the number of casualties. Despite all the obstacles, the Marines were able to capture the airfield, but they were relentlessly attacked by the Japanese hiding in the island's central mountains. By the third day, and still under fire, the Marines began to use the captured airfield to their advantage, conducting several aerial strikes across the island, dropping napalm in cave entrances, and clearing out the jungle to reveal the Japanese hiding spots. From then on, the exhausted Marines had to storm each defensive post one by one, using smoke grenades to conceal themselves and disable the Japanese weapons while infiltrating the caves. The U.S. Marines suffered massive casualties as they sluggishly advanced through the ridges and caves on the island. As the losses skyrocketed, Japanese snipers began to shoot at U.S. stretcher-bearers, confident that if they were injured or shot down, more men would have to return to replace them. The Japanese also broke into the American lines at night to assault the Marines in their fighting holes. In response, the U.S. forces built 2-man fighting holes, so one Marine could sleep while the other kept watch. A particularly vicious encounter then occurred on a ridge known as Bloody Nose for over 6 days. As the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, under the command of Major Raymond Davis, attempted to storm one of the Japanese-occupied hills, they lost over 70% of their men. Captain Everett Pope and his company then infiltrated deep into the ridges, guiding the remaining 90 men to capture the hill. It took them a whole day's fighting to reach what Pope thought was the top, but it actually was another ridge occupied by more Japanese soldiers. Realizing that the enemy forces clearly outnumbered them, Captain Pope set up a small defensive post, which was then assaulted by the Japanese throughout the night. The Marines eventually ran out of ammunition and had to fight the Japanese with knives and fists, even resorting to throwing coral rocks and empty ammunition boxes at them. Almost miraculously, Pope and his men held out until sunrise, which then brought more Japanese onslaughts. By the time they were finally able to evacuate the position, only 9 Marines were left. Pope would later receive the Medal of Honor for his bravery. The intricate labyrinth of ridges and caves spread across the island became a lethal trap for the Marines trying to make their way to the top of Umurbrogel Mountain, and the operation that was supposed to take 3 days soon became 2 weeks, then 3, then 4. Ultimately, the 1st Marine Division was brutally damaged and stayed out of action until the invasion of Okinawa on April 1, 1945, suffering over 6,500 casualties during its month on Peleliu, while the 81st Infantry Division suffered up to 3,300 losses. On the other hand, the Japanese lost over 14,000 men, close to 10,000 on Peleliu and the rest in the nearby islands. The Imperial soldiers fought fiercely to the end, with Nakagawa fighting until all hope of victory was gone, and then committing a ceremonial suicide. Notably, the Japanese were so devout to fighting until the end that a Japanese lieutenant continued hiding on the island and conducting guerrilla warfare until 1947. It would take a retired Japanese commander to convince him that the war was over and that he needed to go home. The battle became highly controversial in the United States due to the enormous casualties suffered, on top of the island's lack of strategic value. Further analysis revealed that the Japanese soldiers on the island lacked the means to interfere with potential U.S. operations in the Philippines, while the captured airfield did not play any role in the subsequent invasion of the country. Instead, the Ulithi Atoll in the Caroline Islands was used as a staging base for the invasion of Okinawa. The The battle could have become an even greater scandal if it wasn't because minimal news reports were published about it. This was partly due to Rupertus's initial prediction of a 3-day victory, which attracted only 6 reporters to the scene. The battle was also eclipsed by the Allies' push towards Germany in Europe, which can easily explain how one of the most difficult fights the Marines encountered during the entire war managed to evade the spotlight for many decades. Furthermore, as many of the brutal encounters took place deep inside the island's caves, several U.S. servicemen that lost their lives were never recovered after the battle. The remains of over 2,600 troops have never been found, and recent efforts are underway to reopen some of the blocked caves and find those that gave their lives in the Battle of Peleliu. It was late June of 2005 in the Kunar province of Afghanistan, and 4 outnumbered U.S. Navy SEALs were pinned down, low on ammunition, and without high ground advantage. As the seconds turned into minutes, and the minutes into hours, the escape options began to run out. Over 100 insurgents had steadily cornered them, and more enemy combatants were on their way. Team leader Michael Murphy realized that the only hope for survival was to call in a quick reaction force, and in a heroic move, he left the safety of his cover and went straight for a clearing in the mountain to contact friendly troops, completely exposing himself to enemy fire. All the 4 wounded operators could do was wait for friendly cavalry to arrive before it was too late. Operation Red Wings was a combined joint military operation to take place in the Pek district of the Kunar province of Afghanistan. The operation's objective was to locate an HVT, or high-value target, a ruthless insurgent that went by the name of Ahmad Shah and was responsible for the loss of many civilians and American servicemen, especially U.S. Marines. Shah, also known as Muhammad Ismail, was a versatile guerrilla fighter since he was a youngster. He grew up in the mountains of Kunar province and knew the region well enough, which helped him and his men move around quickly and stealthily. When American forces dared venture into his home turf, they played by Shah's rules. His guerrilla group was called the Mountain Tigers for a reason. Like the ancient mammal, they knew when and how to stalk their prey. As such, the U.S. troops had failed to capture him or neutralize his tigers. Shah was also communicating with the Taliban and other rebel groups that operated close to the Pakistani border, and his connections with other hostiles and the continuous acts of violence gave him increasing prominence. The U.S. Armed Forces had to do something radical to get rid of him. On June 27, 2005, an elite team of 4 United States Navy SEALs walked up the ramp of an MH-47 Chinook helicopter. They were heavily armed and had plenty of ammunition and supplies to live in the wilderness for several days. The SEAL Special Reconnaissance Team, or SR, comprised Lieutenant Michael Murphy and Petty Officers 2nd Class Marcus Luttrell, Matthew Axelson, and Danny Dietz. The men were part of Phase 1 of Operation Red Wings. As a reconnaissance force, their duty was to infiltrate the region where it was suspected that Shah was hiding and guide an action team towards the target. Phase 2 comprised the SEAL Direct Action Team. Under the guidance of the SR team, their task was to either capture or terminate Shah and his men. Once done, Phase 3 would be launched, with the insertion of Marines and Afghan friendlies that would sweep through the nearby valleys to form an outer cordon and eliminate any insurgent resistance. Phase 4 then involved stabilizing the zone and providing medical needs to the local population, establishing schools, roads, and other urban necessities. Finally, Phase 5 was the exfiltration process. If enemy activity persisted, some Marines would remain in the area to safeguard the population. As the sun settled on the fateful evening of June 25th, the 4 SEALs left Bagram Air Base to begin Phase 1. U.S. Army Captain Matt Brady was the pilot of the MH-47 Chinook helicopter that was tasked with inserting the SEAL Special Reconnaissance Team deep into enemy territory. Brady was part of the Army's elite 160th Special Operations Regiment, or SOAR, also known as the Night Stalkers. Their job was to quietly insert the SR team and follow up with a second SEAL team the following night. As the Chinook approached the valleys surrounding Kunar province in the middle of the night, another American helicopter followed them closely to perform decoy drops and confuse the enemy. They then approached the insertion zone, and the AC-130 providing overwatch radioed Brady to let him know they were leaving due to a mechanical failure. Although such a change of plans would usually mean an instant mission abortion, Captain Brady decided to carry on with his duty, believing that the AC-130 would be back in action in no time. The insertion zone was on a ridgeline where it was impossible to land the 4 special operators. Consequently, the Chinook hovered over the landing zone and stayed above the canopy of the trees while the commandos prepared to drop using a fast rope. As the men started to jump, Captain Brady saw through his night vision goggles that numerous lights were dotting the mountains below, which was odd for such a quiet night. One of the 4 SEALs went down and disappeared into the bushes. Brady returned to Jalalabad to link up with a second group of SEALs and the Quick Reaction Force in case the reconnaissance team was compromised. Once in the area of operations, Lieutenant Murphy got his men into formation and began to move across the landscape. After approaching a covered overwatch position, the 4 SEALs stumbled upon some local goat herders. From there on, the situation quickly escalated. The 4 men rounded up the goat herders while they thought of a solution, and they had an arduous debate about what to do. If they released them, the mission would be compromised, but shooting them was the only way the 4 SEALs could keep the element of surprise. After moments of tension, Lieutenant Murphy released the locals. Knowing that they were compromised, the 4 SEALs then retreated to a safe position from which they could repel an enemy attack. As expected, the Taliban showed in no time, and a furious firefight broke out between the 4 SEALs and over 50 armed combatants. Murphy, Dietz, Axelson, and Luttrell then engaged the enemy with pinpoint accuracy using their M4 rifles from concealed positions. However, their combined firepower was not enough to repel an enemy with the upper edge and knowledge of the battlefield, terrain advantage, and more importantly, the numbers. The SEALs were pushed deeper into a ravine, and the insurgents began launching a series of coordinated attacks from 3 directions as they retreated. Although the Americans managed to take down over a dozen of them, the advance was persistent, and the SEALs attempted to reach the bottom of the mountain to get to safe ground, but there was no way out. Almost an hour into the fight, Dietz attempted to find open air to make a distress call, but he was shot in the hand when he tried to do it. When Murphy noticed that Dietz was wounded, he left his cover and wholly exposed himself to enemy fire while placing the distress call on open ground. While the enemy directed their AK-47 fire on him, he managed to establish contact with Bagram Air Base and requested immediate assistance. The situation was now out of control, and they needed all the help they could get, and they needed it fast. While making the call, Murphy was shot multiple times, including a lethal shot in the back that forced him to drop the transmitter, but he held his ground and kept fighting. Severely wounded, Lieutenant Murphy limped back to his men and continued emptying magazine after magazine to contain the horde of insurgents that had surrounded them. The fate of the 4 hardened SEALs now rested on the shoulders of the operators from the Quick Reaction Force. When the SR team contacted Bagram Air Base for immediate support, the men back on the base could not believe it. Captain Brady was baffled, but honoring his code, the Night Stalkers from the 160th got ready for direct insertion into the hot zone. 2 Chinooks, codenamed Turbine 33 and Turbine 34, took off immediately. Each was carrying 8 Navy SEALs and 8 Night Stalkers. The Chinooks were assisted by Black Hawks and Cobras to neutralize the enemy while they landed. However, knowing that this formation would only slow them down, the Quick Reaction Force raced through the air to assist their brothers in arms. The main risk was getting shot down in the middle of a combat zone in plain daylight. Still, the men were committed to their objective and headed straight towards the last known location provided by Murphy. When Turbine 33 sighted a possible insertion zone in the area, it hovered down and lowered the ramp for the men to deploy, but a rocket-propelled grenade emerged from the tree line as the ramp came down and flew straight into the Chinook. The projectile exploded inside before any operator managed to leave the helicopter. The Chinook then went for a spin before crashing down right into the terrain below the mountain. Turbine 34 watched helplessly as the situation unfolded, but they were immediately ordered to get back to base. Most men did not want to leave, and one SEAL even threatened the pilots to get him down to help his 4 brothers, but there was nothing to do except follow the orders. The men then headed back to base to regroup and coordinate another offensive, as the combat zone was packed with enemies, and it would take a more organized effort to break through. The situation on the ground was desperate for the wounded Navy SEALs. They were pinned down, surrounded, and cornered. There was no way out, and ammunition was running short. Almost 2 hours into the firefight, against overwhelming odds, the area was surrounded by nearly 35 fallen insurgents. Dietz had perished bravely, firing at the enemy until his 5 wounds took their toll on his body, and Lieutenant Murphy was also gone after getting pinned down by the enemy. Axelson and Luttrell were hiding together inside a small hollow, and their last hope of survival was the Quick Reaction Force, but they did not know that they had returned to base. Both men only had enough ammunition for their pistols, but while firing at the insurgents, a grenade launcher hit near Luttrell and sent him down the mountain, leaving him unconscious. When he woke up, he realized he was on his own, and the enemy was furiously hunting him down. Dehydrated, with his legs wounded by bullets and shrapnel, and 3 vertebrae cracked during the fall, Luttrell mustered all the strength he had left to make it out alive. He managed to evade the enemy for an entire day, before stumbling upon a small village where the locals miraculously aided him. Luttrell was taken care of, fed, and given medical attention by the family of Mohammed Gulab for almost 3 days. The Pashtunwali villagers did not say anything when the Taliban showed up to reclaim Luttrell. Meanwhile, the villagers had sent a runner to the closest American base, and a few days later, a team of Army Rangers successfully extracted Luttrell. Operation Red Wings suffered the worst single-day losses since Operation Enduring Freedom began, and was one of the saddest days in Navy SEAL history after the loss of 19 men. The U.S. would launch Operation Red Wings 2 days later to recover the bodies of the fallen servicemen. Years after the operation, Marcus Luttrell would write the book Lone Survivor to tell how Operation Red Wings truly unfolded, and detail how the seasoned Navy SEALs had to deal with adversity from the first hours of the operation. Then, in October of 2007, Lieutenant Michael Murphy posthumously received the Medal of Honor, citing that, quote, "By his selfless leadership, courageous actions, and extraordinary devotion to duty, Lieutenant Murphy reflected great credit upon himself and upheld the highest traditions of the United States Naval Service." The Battle of Chosin Reservoir marked a prominent moment in the Korean War. During the 17 days of fierce battle amidst freezing weather, 30,000 UN command troops were surrounded by 120,000 People's Volunteer Army soldiers from China. These men were under direct orders from Mao Zedong to destroy the UN's forces. The US troops found themselves in the middle of the harshest winter recorded during the war. They were out of supplies, and their guns had frozen. Desperate for artillery, they placed their hope for survival on an artillery airdrop. But to their surprise, the one such drop contained nothing but Tootsie Rolls. The Chinese had the US 10th Corps trapped, or so they thought. However, the US would ultimately pull off a daring breakout to accomplish, quote, "the greatest evacuation movement by sea in US military history." The battle has since become even more legendary, thanks to tales about how the Tootsie Rolls actually saved the US soldiers. It seemed like the Korean War would soon end to the benefit of the UN and South Korea. Key battles were going the UN's way, such as the successful landing at Incheon by the American 10th Corps, the counteroffensive to the Prussian perimeter offensive by the 8th Army, and the rapid overrunning of the North Korean People's Army. The UN forces were advancing into North Korea, hoping to set up a reunification before the end of 1950. Yet this was not without complications. The UN forces were separated into 2 groups in the north, due to the country being split by its central and impassable Taebaek Mountains. The 8th Army had to tread on via the western coast, while the Republic of Korea 1st Corps and the US 10th Corps took the eastern shores. On October 19th of that year, after warning the UN multiple times, the People's Republic of China entered the Korean War by sending soldiers of the People's Volunteer Army into North Korea. One of the first Chinese military units to arrive at the Chosin Reservoir was the 42nd Corps, which was assigned to halting the eastern UN advance. In response, the US 1st Marine Division of the 10th Corps landed at Wonsan on the east coast, taking the Chinese by surprise. It almost immediately started fighting the defending 124th Division of the PVA on November 2nd. By the 6th, the PVA's 42nd Corps ordered the division to retreat north towards the reservoir so that the UN forces would follow. General Douglas MacArthur ordered the 8th Army to launch its Home by Christmas offensive due to the onslaught of sudden Chinese attacks. He saw the Chinese intervention and the changing landscape of the war as, quote, "one of the most offensive acts of international lawlessness of historic record." In support of this offensive, MacArthur had the 10th Corps attack from the west of the Chosin Reservoir to cut the supply line between Manpojin, Kangye, and Huichon. Major General Edward M. Almond, the commander of the 10th Corps, formulated a plan of attack on November 21st. He would have the 1st U.S. Marine Division advance west. Simultaneously, the 7th Infantry Division would protect the right flank, and the 3rd Infantry Division protected the left and rear of the formation. At that point, the 10th Corps was spread out through a thin 400-mile front. When Mao Zedong received news of the Marine landing at Wonsan, he ordered the immediate destruction of the UN forces in a message sent by telegraph. At Mao's request, the formidable PVA 9th Army was quickly sent to North Korea on November 10th, a move that went undetected by the UN forces. Unseen, they penetrated the Chosin Reservoir area on the 17th. The Chosin Reservoir was a sparsely populated area around an artificial lake to the northeast of Korea. In its original language, the place is actually called Shangjin, but the name Chosin, used in the West to refer to the conflict, comes from a mistaken Japanese pronunciation. The UN forces adopted it because they were using outdated Japanese maps. On the other side, official Chinese sources referred to the battle as the eastern part of the second phase campaign. The battle was fought mainly around a 78-mile road connecting the reservoir with Hongnam, which was the only retreat channel for the United Nations forces. The road had been created by cutting through hills and rough terrain with steep drops and climbs. The quality was less than ideal, and was no more than a lane of gravel at some points. As if the conditions weren't difficult enough, the coldest winter experienced during the war was on its way, freezing the reservoir area and making the terrain difficult to tread on. Further than the already lousy weather, November 14th marked the arrival of a cold front from Siberia that pulled the temperature as low as minus 38 degrees Celsius or minus 36 degrees Fahrenheit. The ground froze solid, increasing the likelihood of frostbite, causing weapon malfunctions and leaving ice on the roads. The Army's supplies froze as well, with morphine syrettes needing defrosting, often in the medic's mouth before injection. Some medical supplies were temporarily ruined, such as blood plasma, which became useless once turned to ice. Batteries also struggled to function in the low temperature, making radios and vehicles challenging to handle. The gun lubrication froze many weapons, and the springs on the firing pins would not hit hard enough to shoot, or they would jam. The 30,000 soldiers committed by the US 10th Corps and the UN forces were under intense stress and facing an uphill battle when 120,000 Chinese soldiers launched their attack at the Chosin Reservoir. The Corps, commandeered by Major General Edward Almond, was freezing and in desperate need of supplies. The UN forces, headed by Major Oliver P. Smith, were facing an equally dire situation and in need of more bullets. Badly outnumbered, the coalition forces had earned the nickname, quote, the Chosin Few. The coalition submitted an airdrop request with the codename Tootsie Rolls, which would deliver artillery necessary for their survival. They were shocked to discover that the packages actually contained nothing more than actual Tootsie Rolls. However, the candy ended up being extremely useful. When frozen, the Tootsie Rolls could be used to patch bullet holes and fix their equipment. The sugar also jolted the starving troops. Milton Walker, who drove a communications equipment jeep, would later recall the incident, stating, quote, "That was what most of us survived on for food for the 3 weeks." With the vehicles repaired, the US and UN forces were able to attempt a breakout from the Chinese encirclement. At nightfall on November 27th, the Chinese People's Volunteer Army conducted attacks and ambushes along the road from Kotori and Chosin. The Marines defending at Udam-ni were surrounded and attacked by the Chinese as well. One of the PVA divisions struck the road between Hagaru-ri and Udam-ni, cutting off the line of communication between the forces at the two areas. Caught by surprise, the UN forces were utterly isolated. As the battle raged in freezing conditions at Udam-ni, the People's Volunteer Army attacked the two companies defending the road, Fox and Charlie. Thanks to the success of the aggressive assault, the Charlie Company retreated. Captain William E. Barber's Fox Company was left standing alone on an isolated hill that looked over Toktung Pass. This vital section would cement either side's control of the road. The Marines launched several failed efforts to rescue the Fox Company, putting a significant dent in the Chinese forces. However, ultimately, Captain William E. Barber's company was left to deal with the situation by themselves. Fox Company managed to hold the position for 5 days with artillery support from Hagaru-ri and a few Marine Corsair F-4U fighter planes that dropped napalm. They were under constant attack by the Chinese. The Chinese belatedly realized that the bulk of the UN forces were stationed at Udam-ni and that their garrison was twice as strong as they had previously believed. Because of this, Song Shi-lun considered all further attacks pointless and ordered his 9th Army to redirect its primary efforts towards Hagaru-ri and Sinhung-ni. The forces at Udam-ni got some rest between November 28th and 30th. On the Western Korean front, the US 8th Army was forced to fully retreat from the Battle of the Chungcheon River, which started with surprise attacks on November 25th. The PVA successfully struck the 8th Army's right flank, which allowed them to position themselves at the UN forces' rear. MacArthur ordered the withdrawal of the US 10th Corps to the port of Hongnam. In response, Lieutenant Raymond L. Murray and Colonel Homer L. Litzenberg issued an order requiring the troops to break out from Udam-ni to Hagaru-ri on the 30th. General Oliver P. Smith reportedly stated at the time, quote, "Retreat? Hell, we're not retreating. We're just advancing in a different direction. To retreat, the Marines assembled a convoy led by a single M4A3 Sherman tank. They conducted their attack in the direction of Fox Company, still stranded by itself, so that they could all march through the road at Toktung Pass. On December 1st, the Marines engaged the People's Volunteer Army again, with the Marines forced to dig in on slopes between peaks and trails to attack the Chinese defenders. The PVA returned attacks on Yudam-ni as one of their divisions headed for Kotori. The PVA struck at night with such force that night fighter planes had to be called in to cover their rear forces and fend off the attacks. The fighting continued until dawn on the 2nd. It only truly stopped once all the Marines had withdrawn from the area. By then, the Chinese forces were considerably diminished at Yudam-ni and Hagaru-ri. Song Shi-lun ordered his troops at Kotori and Hongnam to dig in near Funchilin Pass to destroy an essential treadway bridge. They hoped this obstacle would allow the remaining PVA forces to reunite and catch up to the retreating UN forces. To overcome the problem of the destroyed passage, the U.S. 314th Troop Carrier Wing provided 8 C-119 flying boxcars to drop portable bridge sections by parachute. The United Nations forces finally arrived at the Hongnam evacuation perimeter on the night of December 11th. By the time the UN forces arrived at the port city of Hongnam, General Douglas MacArthur had already given the evacuation order for the U.S. 10th Corps. Subsequently, the U.S. would conduct an evacuation deemed one of the greatest, if not the greatest, in U.S. military history, sometimes called, quote, the Christmas Miracle. 193 ships arrived at the port to carry away coalition troops, their heavy equipment, and about a third of the Korean refugees in the area. One of the involved vessels, the SS Meredith Victory, was only assigned to carry 12 people, but left the port with 14,000 refugees on board. After the last United Nations unit departed on December 24th, the port was destroyed so the Chinese couldn't use it. The People's Volunteer Army entered Hongnam the following morning, signaling a new phase in the Korean War.